There are moments in life when the strength of a man is not measured by the medals he carries or the scars he hides, but by the silent bond he shares with the one who saved him. We live in a world quick to judge, where rules are quoted louder than compassion, and where appearances too often outweigh sacrifice. Yet beneath all that noise lies a truth. Dignity is not something given, it is something earned, carried, and defended. What you are about to hear is not a tale of loud battles or decorated ceremonies. It is a quiet war fought in everyday places, a restaurant, a park bench, a city street, where respect is tested and loyalty shines through. It is the story of Daniel, a Marine who carried home both wounds and survival, and Rocky, the dog who became his second heart. Stay with me, because as their steps take us into a crowded room and back out into the open air, you will see how easily a man can be humiliated and how swiftly a community can be awakened. This is a story of denial, of truth revealed, and of the unbreakable bond between a warrior and his four-legged brother. Let's begin. The evening sun had just begun to sink toward the horizon when Daniel pushed open the glass doors of the Blue Water Grill. The scent of fried calamari and grilled salmon drifted toward him, mixed with a sharper tang of citrus cleaner still lingering on the freshly mopped floor. He stood for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light, one hand resting on the leather harness at his side. At his feet, Rocky waited, steady and calm, the very image of discipline. Rocky was no ordinary companion. His coat, a burnished golden brown, caught the light in a way that made heads turn. But his movements were precise, deliberate. As Daniel stepped inside, Rocky matched him step for step, easing slightly ahead when the veteran's balance wavered, then slowing until Daniel's gait steadied. Years of shared training and battlefield instinct passed between them, without the need for words. Daniel spotted an empty booth in the corner, away from the bustle of the main dining room. He moved toward it, grateful for the quiet it promised. His knees ached tonight, the old shrapnel wounds reminding him of their presence. Rocky circled once, then tucked himself beneath the table with practiced ease, his head resting against Daniel's boot. From a distance, it would have been easy to miss the dog entirely, but someone noticed. A young waitress, barely out of her teens, froze mid-step when she caught sight of Rocky. Her brows pinched, and she turned on her heel toward the bar where the manager stood polishing glasses. Her whisper was sharp enough to cut through the low hum of conversation. Within moments, the manager set the glass aside and strode across the room, his black tie swinging with his movements. "Sir," he said, his voice carrying louder than necessary, "we don't allow pets in here." Heads lifted from plates. Forks paused midair. A ripple of attention spread outward, drawing eyes to the corner booth. Daniel kept his expression steady, though he felt the sting of dozens of strangers' curiosity. "This isn't a pet," Daniel answered calmly. He gestured toward Rocky. "He's a service dog." The manager's lips pressed thin. "Health codes don't permit animals in a food establishment." "I'm sure you understand." Daniel's hand slipped to the folded wallet card he carried for moments like these. He opened it slowly, revealing official documentation that had long since grown soft around the edges from years of use. "Federal law makes an exception for service animals. He's trained to assist me. He's not a risk to your establishment or your customers." The manager glanced at the card but did not touch it. Instead, he raised his chin slightly, his voice climbing higher, more insistent. "I can't have guests complaining. People come here to enjoy dinner, not to eat next to a dog." From a nearby table, a woman wearing pearl earrings leaned closer to her husband, but her words carried across the space. "A dog is a dog. Some rules matter for a reason." A flush of heat crept up Daniel's neck. He fought to keep his composure, though the room seemed to shrink around him. His heartbeat quickened, not with rage but with the sharp familiarity of being on display. Measured, found wanting. He leaned forward, his voice even, though his knuckles whitened where they rested against the table. "This dog," he said, "pulled me from burning wreckage in Kandahar. He stood between me and death more times than I can count. He doesn't leave my side, not here, not anywhere." For a brief moment, silence stretched thin across the room. Then the manager crossed his arms. "I'm sorry, sir. If you want to dine here, you'll need to leave the dog outside." Rocky lifted his head then, as if sensing the shift in tension. his dark eyes fixed on Daniel's face. Steady, waiting. The Marine took a slow breath, willing the tremor in his chest to ease. He knew an unwinnable battle when he saw one. Pride would not feed them tonight, nor would shouting change a mind already set in stone. Daniel rose from the booth, the motion stiff with pain. Rocky slipped out from beneath the table, posture tall, tail still. Together, they turned toward the exit, moving past the gawking eyes and whispered commentary. Daniel kept his gaze forward, his back straight, his dignity intact. The door closed behind them with a hollow thud. Inside, conversation resumed in uneven bursts, but for Daniel, the evening air felt like both relief and condemnation. On the sidewalk, the city buzzed as though nothing had happened. Cars rolled past, headlights flickering against shop fronts. Somewhere down the street, a child's laughter rang out. And yet in that moment, Daniel felt the invisible weight of the room he had just left pressing hard against his chest. He adjusted the strap of his jacket and murmured, "Come on, boy." Rocky leaned close, his flank brushing Daniel's leg with each step. A silent reassurance carved from years of shared survival. No medals pinned to his chest, no uniform upon his back. Yet in that quiet walk away from the Blue Water Grill, both man and dog carried honor heavier than any burden the world could place upon them. And though they said nothing, both knew this was not the first time, nor would it be the last. The evening air outside the Blue Water Grill carried the tang of salt from the harbor and the faint exhaust of passing cars. Daniel paused on the sidewalk, pressing a hand against the ache in his hip. Rocky stood steady beside him, ears flicking at the city sounds. Horns, a bicycle bell, the rustle of footsteps rushing past. Together they began down the street, their pace unhurried, though Daniel's chest still burned from the sting of rejection. Not far from the door, an elderly couple sat on a bench. The man wore a faded baseball cap with a Navy emblem stitched across the brim. He nudged his wife gently and nodded in Daniel's direction. Their eyes followed him, kind and knowing, yet they did not rise, did not speak. They offered the only thing they could in that moment, silent recognition. Daniel caught it, gave the briefest nod in return, and moved on. Further down, a cluster of college kids spilled out from a cafe, laughter spilling into the night like clattering glass. One of them raised a phone, the lens pointed shamelessly at Daniel and Rocky. "Hey, look at this," the boy crowed, his voice mocking. "Man got kicked out of the grill with his mutt. Must have been some scene." The others cackled, leaning into each other, thumbs dancing across screens as though humiliation were a sport. Daniel kept walking, jaw tight, though inside the familiar storm churned. The weight of being both visible and invisible at once. Rocky's flank brushed against his leg, steadying him as memories threatened to crowd the present. At the end of the block, a narrow park opened like a quiet refuge. Daniel guided Rocky toward an empty bench beneath a lamppost that buzzed faintly against the darkening sky. He lowered himself onto the worn wood, exhaling as though he'd been carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders since stepping into that restaurant. From his jacket pocket, Daniel pulled a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, the kind he always packed, just in case. He tore it in half, laying one piece on a napkin at his side. Rocky didn't lunge for it, didn't even move. He waited until Daniel gave a soft signal, then leaned forward, teeth gentle as he accepted the offering. They ate together in silence, the world passing by without notice. Rocky remained half alert, eyes sweeping the shadows beyond the lamplight, ears twitching to every shuffle and cough that filtered through the night. Daniel's hand slipped into his other pocket, drawing out a photo softened by years of folding and unfolding. The edges curled, the surface creased, but the image still held its power. In it, a younger Daniel lay strapped to a stretcher, uniform torn and bloodied, face smeared with grime and pain. Beside him stood Rocky, eyes fierce, chest heaving, a tag glinting at his collar. Bravo Unit K9. Daniel stared at the image for a long moment, his throat thick. The memory rushed back with unrelenting force. The heat of fire consuming metal, the acrid smoke choking his lungs, the chaos of shouts and gunfire. He remembered the pressure of Rocky's body forcing him out of twisted wreckage, the dog's jaws gripping his vest and dragging with impossible determination. He remembered the way Rocky had stood over him afterward, growling at anyone who came too close, until Daniel's unit arrived. The world had moved on, wars declared over, medals distributed, parades marched. But for Daniel, the war lingered in bone and scar. And for Rocky, the war lingered in instinct. Every fiber still trained to guard and protect. He lowered the photo onto his knee and whispered almost to himself, "Kicked out again, aren't we, boy?" Rocky lifted his head, pressed his muzzle into Daniel's thigh, and left it there. No words, no explanation, just presence. That was all Daniel needed. A bus rattled past on the street and its side plastered with an advertisement. "Honor our veterans, support those who served." The bright letters blazed against the metal, reflecting the lamplight in mocking contrast to the reality of the evening. Passengers stared blankly through the windows, eyes sliding past Daniel and Rocky without recognition. The sign kept rolling with the bus, vanishing into the night as if it had never existed. Daniel reached into his bag once more and withdrew a small plastic pillbox. The hinge creaked as he opened it, revealing neatly sorted compartments of medication. He tapped one tablet into his palm and held it between finger and thumb. Rocky watched intently, not for the pill itself, but for the ritual that accompanied it. Daniel chuckled softly, humorless. "You remember the drill." He slipped the pill onto his tongue, swallowed dry, then leaned down to stroke Rocky's neck. There, beneath the fur, ran a faint scar, jagged, pale, a mirror to the one that curved along Daniel's side. They had taken the same shrapnel blast, survived the same explosion, carried the same burden etched into flesh. He rested his forehead against Rocky's for a long moment. Around them the world bustled on, the shuffle of late commuters, the clink of glasses from a rooftop bar, the echo of distant music. Yet in the circle of lamplight, there was only man and dog, survivor and guardian, tethered by more than leash or law. Daniel leaned back at last, drawing in a slow breath. He could taste the salt of the sea on the breeze, could hear the laughter of the college kids fading as they turned down another street, could feel Rocky's steady weight against his leg. This wasn't the first time they'd been turned away, and it would not be the last. The world didn't always see the difference between a pet and a lifeline, between a nuisance and a comrade. But Daniel had long since accepted that battle. What mattered was the bond at his side, unshaken, unbreakable. He looked down at Rocky and whispered, "As long as we've got each other, that's enough." Rocky's tail thumped once against the ground, deliberate and calm, as if agreeing. The lamplight flickered above them. Somewhere across the street, the glass door of Blue Water Grill opened once more, releasing a brief surge of laughter and clatter into the night before it swung closed again. Inside, life continued without them. Out here, on a weathered bench beneath a buzzing light, Daniel and Rocky carved out their own kind of peace. Neither of them knew that in just a few hours, the quiet humiliation of that evening would ignite something far greater than either had imagined. The bond that carried them through smoke and fire was about to ripple outward, demanding recognition not just from one restaurant, but from a community and beyond. For now, though, Daniel sat with his hand resting on Rocky's back, eyes fixed on the darkened sky, waiting for the weight in his chest to ease. The dog stayed pressed against him, steady as stone, unflinching as the world kept spinning. The night deepened, but inside the Blue Water Grill, the air remained thick with chatter and the clink of cutlery. Patrons had settled back into their meals after the earlier scene, though the memory of it lingered in hushed remarks and sideways glances. Some diners had shaken their heads with disapproval, others with indifference. The manager had returned to his post at the bar, polishing glasses with a satisfaction that suggested he believed he had upheld the rules. Then the door opened again and the atmosphere shifted. 5 Marines stepped inside, their uniforms crisp, their posture commanding. The clatter of forks against plates faltered, the conversation dimmed, and an invisible current of attention snapped toward them. The lead figure, Captain James McMillan, moved with a steady authority that needed no announcement. His medals gleamed under the restaurant lights, but it was his eyes, calm, unyielding, that anchored the room. The Marines did not wait to be seated. They moved in a line toward the center of the dining area, their polished shoes tapping against the hardwood floor with a rhythm that silenced what little noise remained. A young hostess half rose from her station, mouth opening to greet them, but the weight of their presence held her words back. McMillan stopped before the bar where the manager stood. He didn't raise his voice, but that every syllable carried across the restaurant. "I'm looking for Daniel Hayes and Sergeant Rocky." The manager blinked, confusion flickering across his face. "They were here earlier," he admitted, his tone uneasy. "But they left." Murmurs rippled through the room. Several diners exchanged startled looks, and phones lifted discreetly, screens glowing as they began to record. The Marine stood unflinching, the tableau so striking it demanded preservation. McMillan leaned slightly forward, his voice steady as stone. "Daniel Hayes is a retired Marine. He carried men out of fire and shrapnel. He saved lives in silence while chaos roared. And Rocky," his gaze swept the room, holding the eyes of those who had witnessed the earlier dismissal. "Rocky has more confirmed saves than most combat medics. He holds the rank of sergeant. He was decorated for valor with the Navy and Marine Corps medal." Gasps escaped from the crowd. A few people lowered their phones, guilt pressing against curiosity. At a table near the window, a woman who had muttered earlier about a dog being a dog shrank into her seat, cheeks flushing. McMillan did not pause. "That dog isn't a pet. He's a soldier, a brother, and tonight he was treated as less than nothing." The words struck harder than any shout. They cut through the air, leaving silence in their wake. The other Marines shifted only slightly, their hands clasped behind their backs, their chests rising and falling in perfect unison. McMillan reached into his jacket and pulled out a framed photograph. He placed it on the counter before the manager, sliding it forward with deliberate care. The image showed Rocky, younger but unmistakable, standing over Daniel on a battlefield, ears alert, eyes blazing with defiance against the chaos that surrounded him. Across the bottom, in bold letters, a single word was etched: "Brother." "You shouldn't need to know someone's service record to treat them with dignity," McMillan said. His tone softened, but the weight of it pressed harder. "Respect is not earned by asking for documents or demanding explanations. Respect is given because it's right." The manager's throat bobbed as he tried to swallow. His polished exterior faltered, his hands twitching against the towel he still clutched. Around him, the staff stood frozen, their eyes wide, caught between shame and the urge to disappear. A Marine near the back of the group stepped forward slightly, his voice low but carrying. "The Veteran Support Network already knows. More than 15,000 members have received the alert. They're watching, and they'll remember how this place treated one of their own." The weight of the statement pressed on every corner of the room. Diners shifted uncomfortably in their seats. What had begun as an evening meal had transformed into a reckoning, a moment too sharp to ignore. The silence stretched until the only sound was the faint hum of the lights above. Finally, McMillan turned away from the counter, his gaze sweeping the faces turned toward him. He didn't shout, didn't scold. He simply let the truth hang heavy in the air. One by one, the Marines pivoted and walked toward the door, their exit as precise as their entrance. The rhythm of their steps echoed long after the door closed behind them. The restaurant exhaled at once, as though the very walls had been holding their breath. Some diners stared into their plates, unable to meet each other's eyes. Others whispered apologies to no one in particular. The woman with the pearl earrings dabbed her mouth with a napkin, though she had lost her appetite. At the bar, the manager remained rooted, the photograph still resting before him. The word brother stared back, unwavering, undeniable. The youngest waitress, the one who had first spotted Rocky, shifted uneasily. Her gaze lingered on the photo, then darted toward the door as though half expecting Daniel to return. Something in her expression cracked. Regret, perhaps, or the dawning realization that rules followed without understanding could wound more deeply than they protected. Outside, the night carried on, unaware of the upheaval within. Cars rolled past, neon lights blinked across storefronts, the harbor breeze swept cool against the sidewalks. Daniel and Rocky sat blocks away, unaware that their quiet departure had ignited a storm of conscience behind them. In the restaurant, the framed photo remained on the counter long after the last dish had been cleared. A silent witness to the moment dignity had demanded to be seen. For the staff of the Blue Water Grill, there would be no easy forgetting, no quiet dismissal of what had unfolded. The image of Rocky standing guard, the word etched beneath it, and the presence of 5 Marines who had spoken without anger, but with unshakable truth. These would linger like shadows burned into the walls. Change had begun, though it would not take root without struggle. Tonight was only the spark. The fire of accountability would follow. And somewhere across the city, Daniel and Rocky shared a quiet night, unaware that their absence had spoken louder than their presence ever could. Across the street from the Blue Water Grill, the parking lot sat half empty, lit by a flickering street lamp that hummed against the night. Daniel rested in the cab of his pickup, the window cracked open to let in the salt-scented breeze from the harbor. Rocky lay stretched across the passenger seat, his head nestled against Daniel's thigh, his breathing steady, his ears twitching at every sound. The bench where they had eaten their sandwich was behind them now, but the heaviness lingered. Daniel's gaze drifted toward the restaurant's glowing windows. He could see silhouettes moving inside, the rhythm of people returning to their meals. To him, it was just another place, one more building among many, but the sting of being unwelcome clung like smoke in his chest. He reached down, fingers brushing Rocky's fur. The dog stirred slightly, his tail thumping once against the seat before settling again. That quiet acknowledgement was enough to draw a faint smile from Daniel. "We're all right," he murmured. "We've been through worse." Minutes stretched into an hour. The hum of the city softened into the background. A car pulling away, laughter echoing down the block, the distant horn of a ship out on the water. Daniel considered turning the key, driving home, letting the day fade into memory. Yet something held him there, as though unfinished business lingered in the night air. Inside the Blue Water Grill, the youngest waitress stood apart from the others, her apron crumpled in her hands. She had watched the Marines leave, watched her manager pale at their words, watched the photograph left behind on the counter. Guilt pressed against her chest with an urgency she could not ignore. She remembered the look on Daniel's face when the manager had told him to leave, the dignity in his refusal, the steady calm in his voice. She remembered the dog, silent, disciplined, patient. While the others cleared tables, she slipped into the kitchen, her mind racing. From the counter, she took one of the day's specials, a portion of roast chicken with seasoned vegetables, carefully boxed, and added a slice of the restaurant's popular pecan pie. She tucked in a napkin, folded neatly, and then paused. Grabbing a scrap of notepad, she scribbled quickly, her hand shaking slightly as she wrote, "We were wrong. Please let us make it right." She folded the note, slipped it on top of the pie box, and tied the containers together with twine. With the bundle in her hand, she pushed through the swinging doors and out into the night. Daniel noticed her immediately. The door across the street opened, spilling a wedge of golden light onto the pavement. The girl stepped out, hesitated, then crossed toward him with uncertain steps. He rolled down the window a little farther, Rocky lifting his head to watch her approach. She stopped a few feet from the truck, clutching the bundle to her chest. "Sir?" she began softly, her voice catching. "I know you don't owe us anything, but I wanted you to have this." Daniel studied her, the weariness in his eyes tempered by a patience he had learned long ago. He nodded once, encouraging her to continue. She stepped closer and set the package carefully on the edge of the truck bed. "It's not enough," she admitted, "but I couldn't let the night end without trying." Rocky sniffed the air, his nose twitching at the scent of chicken and pecans, but he stayed still, waiting for Daniel's command. Daniel reached out, picked up the package, and set it gently on the seat beside him. His fingers brushed against the folded note, and he read it silently under the dim light from the lamp post. The words were clumsy, simple, but they carried sincerity. He looked back at the girl. Her eyes were wide, filled with a mixture of fear and hope. She seemed younger than her uniform had suggested, perhaps still in school, working nights to make ends meet. For a long moment, Daniel said nothing. The silence stretched, filled only by the distant murmur of the harbor and the rustle of leaves in the night breeze. Then finally he inclined his head. "Thank you," he said quietly. The words carried no judgment, no bitterness, no absolution. They were simply acknowledgement, nothing more, nothing less. Relief washed across the girl's face. She nodded quickly, tears threatening to spill, then turned and hurried back across the street before her courage could falter. Daniel watched her go, his expression unreadable. He looked down at Rocky, who thumped his tail once against the seat, a soft sound like the closing of a chapter. Daniel exhaled slowly, the weight in his chest easing, if only by a fraction. He opened the package and set a small piece of chicken aside for Rocky, who accepted it gently, chewing with care before resting his head back on Daniel's knee. The dog's eyes were calm, his single tail wag a quiet verdict. Not forgiveness, not forgetting, but a measured ceasefire. Across the street, behind the restaurant windows, the staff had noticed. Some stood near the glass, watching from a distance. Their faces carried a mixture of regret and awe as they saw the veteran accept the offering, saw the dog's quiet response, saw the fragile bridge being built across the gap of humiliation. The moment did not erase the past, nor did it repair the wound entirely. But it planted something, a seed of change, small but alive. The gesture, however simple, carried the possibility of growth, of reflection, of accountability. Daniel leaned back in his seat, the box balanced on his lap. He tore off a small piece of bois and let the sweetness melt across his tongue. It wasn't about the food, it was about what it represented. An attempt, a start. He stroked Rocky's head, his voice low and steady. "One step at a time, boy. That's how it always goes." Rocky shifted closer, his weight pressing against Daniel's leg, anchoring him in the present. Together, they sat in the quiet of the lot, the hum of the lamppost above, the faint crash of waves against the pier, the distant murmur of voices from within the grill. Neither man nor dog needed to speak of the future. They had learned long ago that change rarely came in sweeping tides. It came in moments, in gestures, in the courage of individuals willing to admit they were wrong. That night, a single waitress had carried that courage into the dark, and though her act could not erase the pain, it carved a path forward, however narrow. For Daniel and Rocky, that was enough. For now. 1 week after the incident, the Blue Water Grill looked the same from the outside. Warm lights glowing through tall windows, the faint aroma of seafood drifting down the street. Yet for those who had been present that night, and for those who had heard the story ripple outward, nothing about the place felt quite the same. A quiet transformation had begun, and now its signs were visible for all to see. On the front window, just beside the polished brass handle, hung a new sign printed in bold navy letters. "We proudly welcome all veterans and their service companions." The words gleamed against the glass, framed by a small border of stars. Beneath it, taped carefully at eye level, was a photo collage showing military working dogs throughout history, canines who had served in Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, and even earlier wars, each pictured beside the soldiers who had depended on them. Passers-by paused to read, some nodding in approval, others snapping photos to share. The image of Rocky had found its way into the center of the display, his watchful gaze caught in a photograph that carried weight beyond words. Inside the restaurant, the atmosphere carried a different pulse. The staff moved with more purpose, their interactions shaded by reflection rather than routine. Training sessions had been conducted every morning before opening, led by a disability rights advocate invited by the new manager. Role-playing exercises forced the servers to confront difficult scenarios. What to say, what not to say, how to recognize the signs of a service animal, and above all, how to treat every person with dignity. The former manager was no longer present. His resignation had arrived days after the confrontation with the Marines. In his parting letter, he admitted that rules had blinded him to compassion. "Respect," he wrote, "is not about enforcing policy, but about recognizing worth. I failed in that, and I will carry the lesson with me." The owner of the grill, a woman whose father had served in Vietnam, had read the letter aloud during a staff meeting. When she finished, her voice cracked as she declared, "From this day forward, our house will not simply serve food. It will serve people, fully, equally, and with honor." To mark the change, the Blue Water Grill hosted a small ceremony in the dining room. Local veterans filled the tables, their uniforms ranging from freshly pressed to weathered with age. At the center, Daniel sat quietly with Rocky at his side. The dog sat tall, his chest broad, his tail resting neatly against the floor. He did not fidget or whine. He simply existed with the calm gravity of one who understood the moment. A retired colonel rose to speak, his voice deep and resonant. "Tonight, we honor not only a veteran, but a comrade who happens to walk on 4 legs. Sergeant Rocky has served with valor, with loyalty, and with courage that many men would struggle to equal." Applause filled the room. Daniel lowered his head, one hand resting gently on Rocky's back. The colonel continued, producing a small medal crafted by a local veterans group. On its face gleamed the words, "Four-legged warrior." The medal was slipped onto a ribbon and placed carefully around Rocky's neck. The dog remained still, only his ears twitching as the crowd clapped. His eyes sought Daniel's, and Daniel smiled faintly, scratching behind his ear. "Looks good on you, boy," he whispered. The applause swelled again, echoing against the wooden beams of the restaurant. For a moment, the humiliation of a week prior was replaced by something stronger. Affirmation, not just for Daniel and Rocky, but for every man and woman who had carried invisible scars into everyday life. After the ceremony, the new manager, a woman barely in her 30s, sharp-eyed but soft-spoken, approached Daniel with a handshake. "We can't undo what happened," she said, "but we can make sure it never happens here again." Daniel studied her face, searching for signs of pretense, but found only sincerity. He nodded once, his grip firm, his words measured. "That's all that matters." The community embraced the change quickly. Local families began dining at the Blue Water Grill, not only for the food, but to support the new vision. Children came carrying handmade thank you cards for Rocky, covered in crayon drawings of paw prints and American flags. One little boy approached the dog shyly, clutching a card that read, "Thank you for saving lives." Rocky leaned forward and licked the child's hand gently, earning a squeal of delight that made the entire dining room laugh. On the first Saturday after the changes, the restaurant introduced a new tradition: veteran story dinners. Once a month, a table was reserved for a veteran to share their experiences, whether of combat, recovery, or service at home. Guests listened while eating, not out of voyeurism, but out of a hunger to understand, to connect. At the inaugural dinner, Daniel spoke briefly. He did not tell stories of blood or fire. Instead, he told the story of a dog who dragged him from wreckage, who slept beside him in hospital corridors, who woke him from nightmares with a paw pressed against his chest. He spoke of trust that never wavered, of loyalty that never needed words. When he finished, there were tears at more than one table. Afterward, an older woman approached him with trembling hands. "My husband came home from Vietnam, and no one wanted to hear his stories," she said. "Tonight, I felt like maybe, finally, someone listened." Daniel placed a hand over hers and replied, "Then tonight was worth it." Rocky, ever alert, leaned into the woman's side, and for the first time in years, her shoulders softened. By the end of the evening, the Blue Water Grill had shifted from a place of exclusion to a place of community. Patrons left not only satisfied with their meals, but enriched by the stories shared, the lessons learned, and the reminder that dignity must be practiced daily, not assumed. For Daniel, the change was both strange and steadying. He had not asked for recognition, had not sought to be a symbol. Yet every time he and Rocky entered the restaurant now, eyes turned not with judgment, but with quiet respect. A flag stood in the corner by their table, a small plaque beneath it engraved with the words, "Bravo Team Never Forgotten." It wasn't about the spectacle, nor about apologies repeated endlessly. It was about presence, about a place once marked by rejection becoming a place where belonging was built with intention. Daniel would sit at that corner table, Rocky stretched beneath, and for the first time in a long while, he felt not the edge of suspicion, but the ease of being welcome. And when children approached or strangers nodded in gratitude, he accepted it without fanfare, because he knew it wasn't really about him. It was about every veteran who had been unseen, unheard, unrecognized. The Blue Water Grill had changed its policies. The staff had learned. The community had gathered. And in the center of it all, a Marine and his dog sat quietly, reminding the world that dignity, once denied, could still be restored. Change seldom announces itself with fanfare. It settles quietly, woven into the fabric of daily life until one day, the difference is undeniable. For Daniel and Rocky, the transformation of the Blue Water Grill marked only the beginning. What followed spread further than they could have imagined, touching strangers, neighbors, and even those who had once sneered. One afternoon, weeks after the ceremony at the restaurant, Daniel sat on the porch of his small house at the edge of town. The boards creaked under his chair as he leaned back, watching Rocky stretch out on the steps. A light breeze carried the scent of cut grass and the faint sweetness of lilacs from the garden next door. For the first time in years, the silence felt less like isolation and more like peace. The scrape of shoes on the sidewalk drew Daniel's attention. A young man hovered by the gate, phone in hand, shifting uneasily from one foot to the other. Daniel recognized him instantly, the college kid who had mocked and recorded the scene outside the Blue Water Grill. The boy swallowed hard before speaking. "Sir," he began, his voice awkward, "I wanted to say, I deleted the video. I shouldn't have done it in the first place." Daniel studied him quietly. Rocky had already risen, positioning himself at Daniel's side, watchful but calm. The veteran's gaze lingered on the young man's face. The shame there, the way his shoulders sagged. "My brother enlisted last month," the boy continued, words spilling out as though he feared losing the chance. "When I saw him off, I realized what you must have gone through. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry." Daniel leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped loosely. His voice was even, steady. "Then be that someone now for him and for others. Don't wait until you have to carry the weight of regret." The young man nodded quickly, gratitude shining in his eyes. He left as quietly as he had come, shoulders a little straighter than before. Daniel sat back, Rocky settling once more at his feet. The exchange left a warmth in his chest, not of pride but of release. The knowledge that even small ripples could shift the tide. Life continued with its ordinary rhythms. The grocery store, once a place of sidelong glances and whispered judgment, now became a space of unspoken courtesy. When Daniel walked the aisles with Rocky, clerks greeted them by name, and customers stepped aside with a nod instead of a scowl. No one demanded explanations. No one asked for proof. Respect was offered freely, quietly, without spectacle. But not every day passed without its shadows. One evening, as Daniel and Rocky walked home from the park, a car backfired on the street behind them. The sound cracked through the air like gunfire. Daniel's body froze, his breath caught in his throat, the world tilting back into a desert of sand and smoke. His hands trembled, his pulse racing, panic clawing up his chest. Rocky moved instantly. Without command, he pressed down. He pressed his weight against Daniel's legs, grounding him, forcing his breath to slow. The dog's eyes locked onto his, steady, unyielding, pulling him back from the edge of memory. Daniel knelt, burying his face against Rocky's neck until the dizziness eased, until the sound of passing traffic replaced the roar of war. Around them, a few pedestrians had paused, concern flickering on their faces. But they didn't stare, didn't crowd. They gave him space, offering privacy rather than pity. When his breath steadied, Daniel rose, his hands still tangled in Rocky's fur. "I'm all right," he whispered. The truth lay not in the words, but in the presence beside him, the unwavering bond that had saved him once again. The weeks turned to months. Captain McMillan's unit prepared for redeployment overseas. Before leaving, the Marines invited Daniel to a gathering at the base. The barracks buzzed with energy, laughter, and camaraderie, a rhythm Daniel hadn't felt in years. Though time and age had set him apart, the bond of brotherhood never faded. Toward the end of the evening, McMillan approached with a small box in his hand. He opened it to reveal a unit coin, engraved with the emblem of their division. He placed it in Daniel's palm. "This is from all of us," McMillan said, "because you're still part of this unit, no matter where you are." Daniel closed his fingers around the coin, the metal warm from McMillan's hand. He slipped it into his pocket, where it would join the photo of Rocky taken years ago. Two tokens of brotherhood, carried always. When the night ended, Daniel stood by the gates with Rocky as the Marines prepared to leave. He raised his hand in a final salute, the gesture crisp despite the ache in his shoulder. McMillan returned it with equal gravity. Then the unit was gone, leaving Daniel once more with Rocky, silence settling around them like an old friend. Back home, the rhythms of life grew steady again. Evenings found Daniel and Rocky on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, the world bathed in gold. Sometimes neighbors stopped to chat, offering small kindnesses, a plate of cookies, a bio, a word of thanks. Other times, silence reigned, filled only by the sound of crickets and the gentle creak of the chair beneath Daniel's weight. Rocky lay at his feet, head resting on his paws, his breathing slow and even. His muzzle had begun to gray, but his vigilance never waned. Every noise still drew a flick of his ears, Every shift of Daniel's breath still brought a glance upward, ensuring all was well. The bond they shared was etched not just in memory, but in the very patterns of their lives. It was in the way Rocky moved instinctively to Daniel's weak side, the way Daniel's hand found Rocky's fur in the middle of restless nights, the way silence itself had become their language. One evening, a child from down the street wandered up the porch steps, his small hand clutching a toy soldier. He looked up at Daniel, wide-eyed, then crouched to stroke Rocky's head. The dog leaned into the touch, patient, gentle. "Is he really a soldier?" the boy asked softly. Daniel's voice was calm, steady. "Yes, he's my brother in arms." The child's hand lingered on Rocky's fur, a bright in his gaze. Then he stepped back, lifted his toy soldier, and gave a small salute. Rocky didn't move, didn't return the gesture, but his eyes followed the boy with the quiet dignity of one who understood. When the child skipped back down the path, Daniel sat in silence, his chest heavy with something that felt like both sorrow and grace. The war would never leave him, but perhaps through Rocky, through the community, through these small ripples, the weight of it could be shared. As the sun dipped lower, Daniel reached into his pocket, pulling out the coin Macmillan had given him. He held it in one hand, the photo of Rocky in the other, the two pieces together like anchors. Then he set them down on the porch rail, letting the golden light spill across them both. The evening passed in quiet companionship, man and dog side by side, the world beyond their fence moving steadily on. And in that stillness, there was proof enough. Even wounds that never healed could be carried with dignity as long as they were carried together. Months passed, and the sharpness of that evening at the Blue Water Grill softened into memory. Yet memory, as Daniel knew well, was never gone. It merely lay beneath the surface, waiting to be stirred. For him and Rocky, life moved forward in quiet ways. The porch remained their sanctuary, the park their routine, and the corner table at the grill became a symbol not of exclusion, but of belonging. On a cool autumn afternoon, the air crisp with the scent of fallen leaves, Daniel decided to return to the Blue Water Grill. It had been weeks since he last stepped through its doors. He adjusted the brim of his cap, tugged his jacket close, and whistled softly. Rocky trotted to his side, his gait still steady, though age had begun to paint silver across his muzzle. The restaurant looked unchanged from the outside, its windows glowing with the warmth of early evening light. But as Daniel approached, he noticed something new. The sign welcoming veterans and their service companions was no longer just a paper notice taped to the glass. It had been etched into a bronze plaque mounted beside the door. The permanence of it struck him like a quiet vow. This was not a gesture, but a commitment. Inside, the familiar hum of conversation filled the air, punctuated by the clink of glasses and the soft strum of music from the speakers overhead. The staff greeted him not with surprise, but with ease. The hostess smiled warmly. "Good to see you again, Mr. Hayes. Sergeant Rocky." She gestured toward the corner. "Your table's ready." Daniel guided Rocky through the room. Diners looked up, but their gazes carried none of the judgment that had once pierced him. Instead, there were nods, small smiles, murmurs of recognition. A child tugged at her father's sleeve and whispered, "That's the hero dog." Daniel caught the words, his lips curving faintly. At the corner table, a small flag stood in its holder, the plaque beneath it gleaming. "Bravo, team, never forgotten." Rocky settled beneath the table as if he had been waiting for this moment, his head resting against Daniel's boot, his body still carrying the patience of a soldier. Dinner arrived quickly, the young waitress, no longer hesitant, placing the plate with practiced care. She lingered a moment, her eyes shining with gratitude. "We learned a lot because of you," she said softly. Daniel gave a simple nod. There was no need for speeches. The sincerity in her voice was enough. Partway through the meal, another veteran entered, this one with a service dog of his own. The animal was a black Labrador, lean and alert, guiding its handler with measured steps. Daniel watched as the staff responded without hesitation, offering a seat, clearing space with respect, treating the pair not as an inconvenience, but as honored guests. The sight stirred something deep within him. Months earlier, he had been forced to defend his right to sit at a table. Now another man walked in and was welcomed without question. That, Daniel thought, was the true measure of change. Not one apology, not one ceremony, but the quiet confidence that the lesson had taken root. Rocky's ears flicked, and the Labrador glanced back, their eyes meeting in silent acknowledgement. Soldiers recognize one another, even across species. Daniel smiled faintly at the thought. Later, as the evening thinned and patrons drifted out, Daniel rose from the table. Rocky followed, his movements steady, though slower than they once were. The years pressed on them both, but their bond remained unbroken. At the counter, Daniel paused, his gaze resting on the photograph still framed there, the one of Rocky standing over him in the dust and chaos of war. The word etched beneath it, brother, had not faded. The owner, a woman with graying hair tied neatly back, approached him. "We've kept it there," she said. "It reminds us every day of what respect looks like. Not because of policy, but because of people." Daniel inclined his head, his voice low but firm. "Then you've understood." When he and Rocky sped back into the cool night air, the city seemed quieter than before, the streets washed in amber light from the lamps above. He walked slowly toward the truck, each step measured, Rocky's steady presence at his side. At the gate of the park, a small boy stood with his parents. The child held a toy flag in one hand, his eyes widened as he spotted Rocky. Without prompting, he raised the flag in a solemn salute. Daniel stopped, his throat tight, watching the boy's earnest expression. Rocky lifted his head, his eyes steady, his tail wagging once, a gesture as dignified as any salute. The parents smiled shyly, nodding their thanks as they guided the child away. The moment lingered, a reminder that the lessons carried forward were not only for adults, but for the generations to come. That night, back on the porch, Daniel sat with the photo of Rocky in one hand and the unit coin in the other. He laid them side by side on the railing, the porch light casting a glow across their surfaces. Memories pressed in, heat and fire, noise and silence, rejection and respect. Through it all, one truth remained. Dignity was not about recognition alone, but about presence, loyalty, and courage. Rocky rested against him, eyes half closed, chest rising and falling in rhythm with Daniel's own. The world beyond their fence carried on, but in that shared silence lay everything that mattered. Survival, brotherhood, and the reminder that even small acts of courage could alter the shape of a community. Daniel leaned back, the chair creaking beneath him, his voice little more than a whisper. Not all heroes wear uniforms. Some walk beside us, silent, but carrying more than we'll ever know. Rocky's tail thumped softly as if in agreement. For those who had once dismissed him, the lesson had been sharp. For those who listened, it had been lasting. And for Daniel, it was enough to know that his story and Rocky's had left a mark beyond their own lives. As the night settled, he let the weight of memory ease, leaving space for gratitude. Tomorrow would bring its challenges, as every day did, but tonight there was peace, built not from grand speeches or ceremonies, but from the steady truth that dignity, once defended, could endure. And so their story closed not in battle, not in humiliation, but in the quiet triumph of being seen, respected, and remembered. Every community carries the power to wound or to heal. What happened at the Blue Water Grill began as a moment of shame, but became a lesson in humanity. One man and one dog reminded strangers of a truth too easily forgotten, that respect costs nothing, but its absence leaves scars. If you carry anything from this story, let it be this: never measure someone's worth by what you see. Loyalty, sacrifice, and courage often walk quietly beside us, unseen until we choose to honor them. Thank you for walking through this journey. If the story touched you, keep it alive. Share your thoughts, leave a comment, like this video, and follow for more stories that matter.